Hello, class. This is Dr. Hardin again. Welcome back to this video presentation. This talk is going to center itself around the art of self-empathy. We're learning how to resolve conflicts within congregational life. And this is one of the ways that we're going to seek to understand how to do that for the glory of God. So the title of the talk, like I said, is going to be the art of self-empathy. We're going to look at a few things. First, the main point though is we're going to learn more about the concept of self-examination. When you are confronted with conflict, it forces you to take a look on the inside so that you can respond instead of react in a God-glorifying way. And so that's going to be kind of the center of what we're looking at. We've got a few things I want to talk about. If you cannot conduct a thorough self-examination, you're not going to be able to listen well in conflict. And one of the keys is being able to listen well. Because if you can't listen well in a conflict, you're not going to be able to empathize with an opponent. And if you can't empathize with an opponent, you're not going to be able to successfully resolve conflict. Also, we keep hammering this and going back to it again and again and again, but spiritual maturity requires emotional maturity. And self-examination, that ability to look inside, takes emotional maturity. Therefore, there can be no self-examination without spiritual maturity. In other words, we know there's a connection between spiritual and emotional maturity. Emotional maturity specifically dealing with the ability to reflect on oneself. And if you're going to reflect on oneself, that will allow you then to perform a self-examination. And if you can't do that, then you're going to be stymied in your spiritual maturity, and you're going to struggle in helping others resolve conflicts within your congregation. Well, here's kind of the big idea I want you to keep in mind as we move forward throughout this talk. It boils down to this, that self-empathy, that ability to reflect, to be able to understand what's going on inside in response to the conflict, should lead to God's glorification. Isaiah 43:7 tells us that we were created for God's glory. So everything we do should be geared towards increasing our glory reflecting capacities. As we do increase our glory reflecting capacities, we will become more and more conformed to the image of His Son, Jesus Christ. So the big idea, once again, is that self-empathy should lead to God's glorification. What are some of the things we need to understand when you're dealing with conflict? When somebody comes to you, they're upset. They're probably saying some things that aren't very pleasant to hear. Well, the first thing we've got to understand is you need to affirm your identity. Within yourself, you need to, as you're listening to this come at you, you need to be able to remember that you're a child of the King. You've been chosen, blessed, loved, predestined for glorification, to wear that purple robe of righteousness, to be accepted as an heir, not as a slave. And you need to remind yourself of that, because there'll be things that will come your way in the midst of a conflict that will not only deny that, but actually accuse or make accusations that it's anything but that. So when struggling, when you're facing a difficult situation and you need to be able to invoke self-empathy, you need to remember who you are in Jesus Christ. The Bible says that we're more than conquerors in Him, and we need to remind ourselves of that. So affirm your identity is one of the steps. Another thing you need to do is you need to ask God to search your own heart. Psalm 139 talks about that. It says, Lord, search me to see if there's any sin that I'm not seeing. And you need to be able to think of yourself, wait a minute, what's going on? Are my motives pure? Do I have motives? I'm pretty sure I do, but I don't know what they are. And are they pure? So you need to ask God to search your own heart. You need to be able to step back from this conflict and be able to describe what your situation is. What's the context? What's the storyline here that helps us understand why this individual or this group of individuals are bringing difficulty into your life? What's going on? What's the overall picture? What's coming at you, if you will? And you need to ask yourself this: what am I feeling right now? What's happening to me as I'm listening to this physically, or maybe you're reflecting on it soon after the disturbance occurred, the argument or the conflict erupted a little bit. You're sitting there in a quiet moment, just you and God, and you're asking yourself, okay, what am I feeling physically here? What's going on with my pulse rate? How's my breathing? Am I perspiring? What's happening with my body in response to this conflict? And what am I feeling? Am I struggling with anger? Am I scared? Am I hurt? Am I frustrated? What's going on inside me? What's going on inside of me emotionally, but what's going on physically as well? You got to be able to articulate that, because it helps you take grasp of what you're dealing with. And a little bit deeper reflection requires you to ask this question: what am I wanting, desiring, or craving, needing? What is it I'm trying to get out of this conflict? How would I like to see things go? If I had it my way, what would that look like in the end? I think that's a huge question that often we take for granted, and we don't really hold it up to the light to say, okay, what are my motives here? We are motive-driven people. Our hearts desire and they purpose. Hebrews 4 talks about that our hearts are purposeful, planning. They're plotting types of organisms. And so we need to ask ourselves what we're desiring. What do we want out of this situation? We also need to ask ourselves this: how will I be, or how will things be different for me if I get what I want? If I'm a small child and I want chocolate cake before bedtime, but I don't want just a little chocolate cake, I want the whole chocolate cake. Now, that may taste really good while I'm eating it, but chances are I'm going to have a tummy ache when it's over with. So things are going to be different after I partake of the chocolate cake. So you need to ask yourself, okay, look, I know what I want, but how are things going to be different for me if I get what I want? What's the old saying, be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. And you need to make sure that you're seeing things from all perspectives, or with a little bit of wisdom and distance, to say, okay, how will things change if I get this? If I go to the mat on this issue, what's that going to mean? Oftentimes, pastors, for instance, will win a battle and lose the war. They may get their way and be preaching to empty pews, for instance. So you got to ask yourself, look, how will things be different? But often we struggle with forgetting God in the midst of the conflict. We simply are so busy thinking about our next move or counter move, or how we're going to respond, or what we want out of a situation, that we literally forget God and leave Him behind. And that's not a good thing. So we need to ask ourselves, okay, what is God up to in the midst of this situation? Where's He working? What's He trying to get me to see that I'm not seeing possibly? How's He molding the heart of my opponent and trying to help him or her see what they need to see? But make no mistake about it, God is on the move. It's just, are we reflective enough to understand that, to step back and take a look at it? And not only is God on the move, but God's wanting something to come out of this situation. The scriptures say that all things work to the good, who those who love the Lord and called according to His purpose, to be conformed to the image of His Son. So in the midst of misery, God is still working His glory plan. And we need to ask ourselves, hey, what's God trying to do here in the midst of this conflict that will glorify Himself? Usually if we can kind of keep that in mind, it will help us even formulate our own responses. Which brings me to the next thing. How does God want us to respond? If God's working His glory plan even in the midst of conflict, what's He requiring me to do to participate in that glory with Him? How can I shine His glory even more brightly in the midst of the darkness that's fallen over the congregation at that time? So how does He want me personally to respond? So as we think of those steps, we got to ask ourselves a couple of things. Look, what am I doing to become more self-reflective? Because if I'm not self-reflective, I can't employ self-empathy. And if I can't employ self-empathy, I won't be able to listen well. And if I can't listen well, I will not be able to resolve interpersonal conflict within the congregation. And more importantly than that, I will not be able to increase my glory reflecting capacity. And if I can't increase my glory reflecting capacity, I will not be able to glorify God to the extent that He calls me to glorify Him in the midst of the darkness of the conflict. So I hope that that's given you a little bit of a glimpse inside of what we're trying to do with self-empathy. Self-empathy is basically a way to step back, catch your breath in the midst of conflict or right after a conflict, and say, okay, Lord, have thine own way. You are the potter and I am the clay. And so, as you step back, it gives you an opportunity to move forward in a way that glorifies Him and resolves conflict. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this video.